Deep in the shadow-draped hollows of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines, like the breath of sleeping giants, certain family names are still whispered with a mixture of reverence and raw terror. These aren't the Hatfields and McCoys you learned about in history class. These are bloodlines that made pacts so dark, so fundamentally wrong, that even hardened federal investigators refused to document their findings. What you're about to discover isn't folklore or mountain legend. These are the documented remnants of religious movements so twisted that their very existence challenges everything we think we know about faith, family, and the price of desperation in America's forgotten corners. In 1934, a federal marshal investigating missing persons reports in eastern Kentucky wrote in his final dispatch before disappearing himself, "What dwells in these mountains isn't just dangerous, it's infectious." His body was never found, but his notes survived, hidden in federal archives for nearly 90 years, until recently declassified documents revealed the terrifying truth about what he'd discovered. Between 1880 and 1960, at least 7 distinct religious cults emerged from the isolated communities of Appalachia, each more disturbing than the last. These weren't your typical doomsday groups or charismatic leader movements. These were multi-generational family dynasties that twisted Christianity, Cherokee spiritualism, and something far older into practices that claimed hundreds of lives and left scars on the mountain communities that persist to this day. Tonight, we're venturing into territories where cell towers still won't function properly, where GPS systems malfunction without explanation, and where locals will still cross themselves when certain family names are mentioned aloud. The children of the eternal harvest were the first to catch federal attention, though by the time authorities understood what they were dealing with, 3 entire bloodlines had already vanished without a trace. Founded in 1883 by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Thornweave in the remote valleys of eastern Tennessee, this cult began as what appeared to be a typical fundamentalist Christian community. Families seeking religious freedom and agricultural opportunities were drawn to Thornweave's promises of prosperity through righteous living and his claims of direct communication with divine forces. Thornweave had arrived in the region under mysterious circumstances, carrying nothing but a leather-bound journal written in a mixture of English, Latin, and symbols that no scholar has ever successfully translated. He possessed an uncanny ability to identify the most fertile soil, predict weather patterns with supernatural accuracy, and most disturbingly, he seemed to know intimate details about the personal lives of community members he'd never met before. Within 2 years, his settlement had grown to over 200 residents, living in a carefully planned compound centered around a massive wooden structure they called the Sanctuary of Abundance. The cult's central belief system revolved around what Thornweave called the sacred exchange. According to recovered documents, members believed that the earth itself was a living entity that demanded specific offerings in exchange for agricultural prosperity. These offerings began innocuously enough with the first fruits of harvests, portions of livestock, and lengthy prayer vigils during planting and harvesting seasons. The community's crops flourished even during drought years that devastated neighboring farms, and word of their success drew more desperate families seeking relief from the harsh economic realities of mountain life. But the sacred exchange demanded escalation. By 1887, The offerings had evolved to include human hair, fingernails, and small amounts of blood mixed into the soil during planting ceremonies. Thornweave preached that these personal sacrifices created a spiritual bond between the community and the land that would ensure their survival through any hardship. Members reported experiencing shared dreams during these rituals, visions of abundant harvests, and protection from outside threats that felt more real than their waking lives. The first disappearance occurred in the spring of 1889, when a traveling merchant named Samuel Morrison stopped at the compound seeking food and shelter. Community members later claimed he had been welcomed, fed, and sent on his way the following morning, but Morrison never arrived at his next scheduled stop. When his business partners came looking for him, they found the cult members unusually evasive and noticed that the community's crops, already impressive, seemed to have grown noticeably more lush and vibrant since Morrison's visit. Over the following 3 years, at least 12 travelers, missionaries, and government officials disappeared after visiting or investigating the children of the eternal harvest. Each disappearance coincided with dramatic improvements to the community's agricultural output, and members began displaying behavioral changes that disturbed even sympathetic neighboring communities. They spoke in unison during religious services, often completing each other's sentences, even when separated by considerable distances. Children as young as 5 demonstrated advanced knowledge of agricultural techniques they couldn't possibly have learned through conventional means. Most unsettling were the community's expansion projects. Members had begun constructing an extensive network of underground chambers beneath their fields, claiming these were root cellars for food storage. However, the chambers were built to precise geometric specifications that served no practical agricultural purpose, and the walls were lined with the same mysterious symbols found in Thornweave's original journal. Local contractors hired to help with construction reported feeling violently ill when working in these underground spaces, and several refused to return despite being offered unusually high wages. The cult's downfall began in the winter of 1892 when a blizzard trapped a federal postal inspector named Thomas Whitmore at the compound for nearly a week. Whitmore had been investigating reports of mail theft, as numerous letters and packages addressed to people in the region had gone missing. During his forced stay, he witnessed what he later described as the most horrifying religious ceremony he could imagine. In his official report, Whitmore wrote that on the winter solstice, the entire community gathered in the underground chambers for what they called the Deep Offering. According to Whitmore's testimony, the ceremony involved the ritual sacrifice of a community member chosen by lot. The victim, a young mother named Rebecca Hartwell, appeared to participate willingly, even eagerly, in her own death. She was placed on a stone altar in the deepest chamber while the community chanted in their mysterious language. Thornweave used a ceremonial knife to make precise cuts across her body, allowing her blood to flow into channels carved into the chamber floor that directed the blood to specific points around the room where various crops and seeds had been placed. What traumatized Whitmore most wasn't the murder itself, but what happened afterward. As Rebecca died, every member of the community, including children, began convulsing and speaking in voices that weren't their own. They recited detailed information about agricultural conditions, across the entire region, predicted weather patterns for the coming year with impossible accuracy, and most disturbing of all, spoke in the voices of people who had disappeared over the previous 3 years. For nearly an hour, the underground chamber echoed with the voices of the dead, speaking through the living, sharing knowledge about everything from hidden gold deposits to the personal secrets of government officials. Whitmore managed to escape during the chaos following the ceremony, but when he returned with federal marshals and state militia 2 weeks later, they found the compound completely abandoned. Every building had been stripped of personal belongings. Livestock had been slaughtered and left to rot, and the underground chambers had been filled with concrete, mixed with what appeared to be human bone fragments. Most mysteriously, the farmland that had been so incredibly fertile showed no signs of ever having been cultivated. The soil was barren and rocky, as if the supernatural abundance had been nothing more than an elaborate illusion. The fate of the children of the eternal harvest remained a mystery until 1923, when a surveying team working on a proposed railroad line discovered a mass grave in a remote valley nearly 50 miles from the original compound. The grave contained the remains of 198 individuals, including men, women, and children, arranged in the same geometric patterns found in the cult's underground chambers. Forensic examination revealed that all had died during the same time period, likely in late 1892, and many showed signs of having participated in ritualistic bloodletting before their deaths. Most disturbing was the discovery of Thornweave's original journal buried with the bodies. The final entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described his growing realization that the entity he had been communicating with was not divine, but something far older and more malevolent. His last coherent entry read, "The land remembers every drop of blood we gave it. We thought we were feeding the earth, but we were feeding something that lives beneath it, something that has been hungry for so very long. It promised us abundance, but what it really wanted was to taste every soul in our community. The deep offering was never about crops." The journal's final pages contained increasingly frantic sketches of underground creatures with multiple limbs and faces that seemed to shift between human and plant-like features. Thornweave's last entry, barely legible, simply repeated the phrase, "It's coming up through the roots," over and over, until the writing devolved into incomprehensible symbols. The discovery of the mass grave prompted a federal investigation that uncovered evidence of similar cult activities throughout Appalachia during the late 1800s. Government agents found references to the children of the eternal harvest in the personal correspondence of at least 6 other religious leaders who had established isolated communities in remote mountain valleys. These letters suggested that Thornweave's cult was part of a larger network of related groups, all following variations of the same agricultural-based belief system and all eventually meeting similar mysterious ends. Local folklore in the region still speaks of cursed farmland where nothing will grow, of underground chambers that occasionally crack open after heavy rains to release strange vapors that make livestock sick, and of voices that can be heard singing in unknown languages on quiet nights. Modern agricultural experts have documented several areas of inexplicably barren soil in locations that match historical descriptions of cult compounds, and soil samples from these sites contain mineral compositions that don't match the surrounding geology. The children of the eternal harvest represent just the beginning of Appalachia's hidden history of religious extremism. Their story established patterns that would be repeated by increasingly dangerous cults throughout the region over the following decades. Each group began with seemingly legitimate religious motivations, attracted desperate families seeking community and prosperity, and gradually evolved into something that defied both Christian doctrine and basic human morality. What makes these Appalachian cults particularly terrifying isn't just their violence or their mysterious disappearances. It's the suggestion that they were in contact with forces that predate human settlement in the region, entities that offered power and knowledge in exchange for increasingly horrific sacrifices. The mountains themselves seem to have preserved evidence of these encounters, creating a landscape where the supernatural and the historical intersect in ways that continue to disturb anyone brave enough to investigate. The federal documents that have been declassified paint a picture of government officials who quickly realized they were dealing with phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional law enforcement methods. Many of the agents assigned to investigate these cults requested transfers to other regions, and several simply disappeared while conducting their investigations. Those who remained often reported experiencing nightmares, hearing voices, and developing an overwhelming compulsion to avoid certain areas of the mountains entirely. As we delve deeper into the histories of these forgotten cults, patterns emerge that suggest the children of the eternal harvest were not an isolated incident, but part of something much larger and more sinister. The same symbols found in Thornweave's journal appear in the artifacts recovered from other cult sites. The same agricultural impossibilities were reported at multiple locations, and the same mysterious disappearances of entire communities occurred with disturbing regularity throughout the region. The mountains of Appalachia keep their secrets well, but those secrets have a way of surfacing when least expected. In recent years, construction projects, mining operations, and natural disasters have occasionally uncovered evidence of these forgotten communities. Each discovery raises new questions about what really happened in these remote valleys and whether the forces that attracted these cults to the region might still be active today. The story of the children of the eternal harvest is just the first chapter in a much larger and more disturbing narrative about the price of desperation and the dangerous allure of promised salvation in America's most isolated communities. Now, these darker Appalachian bloodlines didn't operate in isolation. By the early 1900s, a web of connections had formed between the surviving cult families, creating what federal investigators would later classify as the Appalachian Shadow Network. The children of the eternal harvest may have vanished, but their influence spread like poison through mountain communities desperate enough to embrace any promise of prosperity, no matter how sinister the cost. The network operated through a system of blood oaths and shared rituals that bound families across 3 states. They communicated through symbols carved into specific trees, arrangements of stones at crossroads, and coded messages passed through traveling merchants. What made this network particularly dangerous wasn't just their individual practices, but how they coordinated their activities to avoid detection while maximizing their supernatural influence over the region. At the center of this network stood the Covenant of the Hollow Crown, established in 1899 when representatives from 7 surviving cult families gathered in a remote cave system known as the Devil's Parliament. The meeting was orchestrated by a mysterious figure known only as the Shepherd, whose true identity remains unknown, but whose influence over these scattered groups was absolute. According to recovered documents, the Shepherd claimed to be a direct conduit to the ancient entity that had originally corrupted the children of the eternal harvest. The covenant operated on a rotating calendar of rituals designed to maintain what they called the Great Working, a continuous supernatural manipulation of the land itself. Each family was assigned specific dates and responsibilities. The Morgantown sect handled the spring blood offerings. The Hollow Creek branch managed summer soul bindings. The Ridgewalker clan controlled autumn harvest sacrifices, and the Winter's End family presided over the most important ceremonies during the darkest months of the year. The Morgantown sect emerged from the remnants of a failed mining operation where 17 workers had died in a suspicious collapse in 1894. The surviving families, led by a charismatic preacher named Cornelius Morgantown, claimed the accident had been a divine message. They established their compound in the abandoned mine shafts, converting the underground tunnels into a maze of ceremonial chambers and living quarters. What distinguished the Morgantown sect from other cult groups was their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and their ability to recruit members from surrounding communities. They operated legitimate businesses, a general store, a sawmill, and even a small church that drew unsuspecting families into their influence. Newcomers were gradually introduced to increasingly extreme beliefs through a carefully orchestrated process that could take years to complete. Their spring blood offerings involved the systematic collection of blood from livestock, wild animals, and eventually human volunteers who believed they were participating in a sacred communion. The blood was mixed with ground minerals from deep within their mine shafts and spread across carefully mapped locations throughout the valley. Locals reported that areas where these offerings took place showed unnaturally rapid plant growth, but the vegetation that emerged was always wrong somehow. Trees grew in spirals, flowers bloomed in impossible colors, and crops produced fruit that tasted metallic and left people feeling nauseated for days after consumption. The psychological control exercised by the Morgantown sect was perhaps their most terrifying aspect. Members reported experiencing shared dreams where Cornelius Morgantown would appear to deliver instructions and prophecies. These dream visitations were so vivid and consistent across multiple witnesses that investigators suspected some form of mass hypnosis or psychological manipulation. Children born into the sect displayed unusual behavioral patterns, speaking in unison during ceremonies and showing an uncanny ability to predict accidents or deaths in the surrounding community days before they occurred. The Hollow Creek branch took a different approach, focusing on what they called soul-binding rituals designed to trap the consciousness of the dying within physical objects. Operating from a series of cabins built along a remote creek that locals claimed never froze, even in the harshest winters, this group was led by twin sisters known only as the Hollow Creek Widows. No one knew their real names or where they had come from, but their influence over the families in their territory was absolute. The soul-binding process involved dying individuals being brought to a specially constructed cabin where the walls were lined with hundreds of small wooden boxes, each carved with intricate symbols and sealed with wax mixed with human hair. As death approached, family members would perform a ritual involving the placement of the dying person's hands on a series of these boxes while chanting in a language that bore no resemblance to any known dialect. Witnesses claimed that during successful bindings, the boxes would grow warm to the touch and emit a faint humming sound that could be heard for miles. The Hollow Creek branch maintained that the consciousness trapped within these boxes could be consulted for guidance and prophecy. During their summer ceremonies, they would arrange hundreds of these soul boxes in complex geometric patterns and conduct lengthy rituals where the trapped spirits would allegedly communicate through a combination of sounds emanating from the boxes and shared visions experienced by participants. The accuracy of the prophecies delivered through these ceremonies was reportedly so precise that families traveled from across the region seeking guidance, bringing with them offerings of food, money, and occasionally their own dying relatives to add to the collection. More disturbing were the reports of boxes that had been damaged or improperly sealed. Locals claimed that broken soul boxes would emit screaming sounds that could drive listeners to madness, and that the spirits contained within would escape to haunt the surrounding area. Several mysterious deaths in the region were attributed to vengeful spirits seeking new vessels, leading to a thriving black market in protective charms and warding rituals. The Ridgewalker clan represented perhaps the most mobile and dangerous element of the network. Unlike other groups that maintained fixed locations, the Ridgewalkers moved continuously through the mountain wilderness, following ancient paths that seemed to exist independently of normal geography. Led by a figure known as the Pathfinder, whose face was reportedly so scarred by ritual scarification that he was unrecognizable as human. This group specialized in what they called flesh walking, a practice that involved the temporary possession of animals and eventually other humans. Their autumn harvest sacrifices were conducted at different locations each year, following a pattern that investigators could never predict or intercept. The Ridgewalkers would arrive at isolated farms and homesteads during the harvest season, initially offering help with crops and livestock. Families who accepted their assistance reported remarkable increases in yield and quality, but at a cost that only became apparent later. Children and young adults who spent time with the Ridgewalkers would begin displaying behavioral changes, periods of missing memory, and knowledge of places they had never visited. The flesh-walking rituals involved participants consuming a mixture of herbs, ground animal bones, and what survivors described as a dark liquid that tasted like copper and made their vision blur and shift. Under the influence of these substances, cult members claimed they could transfer their consciousness into animals, allowing them to scout vast territories and gather information about potential victims or threats. More advanced practitioners allegedly learned to inhabit human hosts temporarily, explaining the reports of loved ones who would disappear for days only to return with no memory of where they had been, but with detailed knowledge of distant events. The most terrifying aspect of the Ridgewalker clan was their ability to appear and disappear without warning. Families would wake to find cult members in their homes, standing silently in bedrooms or kitchens, making no threatening moves, but leaving behind small carved tokens that served as both warning and invitation. Those who kept the tokens reported being visited in dreams by the Pathfinder, who would offer them power and prosperity in exchange for services that were never clearly defined but always involved the gradual corruption of their communities. The Winter's End family controlled the network's most important ceremonies, the rituals that supposedly maintained the connection to the ancient entity that powered all their supernatural abilities. Based in a compound built around a natural hot spring that never froze, this group was led by an elderly woman known as the Winter Mother, whose age was impossible to determine, but who was said to have been present at the original founding of the network in 1899. The winter ceremonies involved the systematic psychological and physical breaking down of selected participants through a process they called the Great Dying. Volunteers, and sometimes those who had been coerced or kidnapped, were subjected to extreme cold exposure, sensory deprivation, and ritualized trauma designed to bring them as close to death as possible without actually killing them. During these near-death experiences, participants reported encountering the same entity that had originally contacted Ezekiel Thornweave, a presence of such alien malevolence that most who encountered it were left permanently changed. Those who survived the Great Dying emerged with abilities that defied rational explanation. They could predict weather patterns months in advance, locate water and mineral deposits by touch, and most disturbingly, sense the exact moment when someone in their vicinity would die. The Winter's End family used these prophetic abilities to position themselves as essential advisors to legitimate businesses and government officials throughout the region, gradually extending their influence far beyond their mountain stronghold. The winter ceremonies also served as recruitment events for the entire network. Representatives from all the affiliated families would gather to witness the Great Dying rituals and select new candidates for initiation into their respective groups. The psychological impact of witnessing these ceremonies was reportedly so intense that many observers would voluntarily join the network simply to avoid becoming victims themselves. By 1920, the Appalachian Shadow Network had grown to include over 30 affiliated groups across Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Western Virginia. Their influence extended into legitimate businesses, local government, and even some mainstream churches. The network had evolved from a collection of desperate families seeking supernatural assistance into a sophisticated criminal organization that used occult practices to maintain control over vast territories. The network's downfall began in 1923 when a federal investigation into bootlegging operations accidentally uncovered evidence of their ritual activities. Agent Samuel Morrison, a decorated World War I veteran assigned to infiltrate moonshine operations in eastern Kentucky, stumbled upon a Winter's End ceremony while tracking suspected liquor smugglers. His official report, classified for decades, described witnessing what he believed to be human sacrifice, combined with psychological torture techniques that surpassed anything he had encountered during the war. Morrison's investigation revealed that the network had been systematically eliminating federal agents and local law enforcement officials who came too close to discovering their activities. At least 12 suspicious deaths of government officials between 1915 and 1923 showed patterns consistent with the network's ritual practices. More disturbing was the discovery that several prominent businessmen and politicians in the region had been attending network ceremonies and using the intelligence gathered through their supernatural practices to manipulate markets and elections. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. Operation Mountain Cleansing, launched in September 1924, involved over 300 agents and soldiers in coordinated raids across the four-state region. However, the network's intelligence capabilities allowed most of the leadership to escape before the raids commenced. Investigators found empty compounds, ritual sites that had been meticulously cleaned, and evidence that suggested the network had been preparing for this eventuality for years. What they did find was horrifying enough to ensure that most details of the operation remained classified. Underground chambers filled with human remains, arranged in ritualistic patterns, libraries of journals written in coded languages that defied translation, and artifacts that seemed to violate basic principles of physics and biology. Most disturbing were the survivors, individuals found in various states of psychological breakdown who claimed to have been participating in rituals designed to contact entities from dimensions beyond human understanding. The network's influence didn't end with the raids. In fact, investigators soon realized that Operation Mountain Cleansing had only scattered the cult members rather than eliminating them. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, reports of similar ritual activities surfaced across the entire eastern United States, suggesting that the network had metastasized, spreading its practices to new territories and recruiting fresh followers from communities devastated by the Great Depression. The legacy of the Appalachian Shadow Network extends far beyond its documented activities. Modern investigators studying unsolved disappearances and ritual crimes throughout the eastern United States have identified patterns that suggest the network's influence may have continued well into the modern era. Reports of coordinated cult activities, ritualistic murders, and supernatural phenomena in rural communities often show similarities to the practices documented in the original network investigations. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that the network represented something larger than just regional cult activity. The sophistication of their operations, their ability to infiltrate legitimate institutions, and their apparent connection to forces beyond human understanding suggests that what happened in Appalachia between 1880 and 1924 may have been part of a much broader and more ancient conspiracy. The mountains that once sheltered these dark practices continue to hold their secrets, and some researchers believe that the network never truly disappeared, but simply learned to operate more carefully, waiting for the right conditions to emerge from the shadows once again. The Appalachian Shadow Network stands as a chilling reminder that in America's most isolated regions, where federal authority was weak and local communities were desperate, conditions existed for the emergence of criminal organizations that combined traditional crime with practices so disturbing that they challenge our understanding of human nature itself. The network's tentacles spread far beyond those mountain hollows, weaving through institutions most Americans never suspected could harbor such darkness. By the 1940s, federal investigators had uncovered evidence that the children of the Eternal Harvest and their allied families had systematically infiltrated key positions across 3 states. Bank presidents, county clerks, state legislators, and even federal postal workers bore the distinctive scarring that marked their allegiance to the old ways. What made this infiltration particularly insidious was how ordinary these individuals appeared in their daily lives. They attended churches, participated in community events, and maintained respectable facades while secretly coordinating a shadow economy built on supernatural transactions. Banking records seized during the federal raids revealed a complex system of coded transactions with specific dollar amounts corresponding to ritual calendar dates and particular supernatural services. The scope of their influence became clear when investigators discovered that several major mining disasters, timber company bankruptcies, and even railroad construction delays had been orchestrated through this network. They weren't just practicing dark rituals in remote cabins, they were manipulating entire regional economies to serve their otherworldly benefactors. One particularly chilling discovery emerged from the personal papers of Harrison Blackthorne, a respected Charleston businessman who had served on the boards of multiple banks and mining companies. His private journals, written in a cipher that took cryptographers 6 months to crack, detailed how network families would identify promising young professionals and slowly recruit them through a process called the gradual binding. The recruitment began innocuously enough. A struggling young businessman might receive an unexpected loan approval. A failing company would suddenly secure a lucrative contract, or a politician facing scandal would find their problems mysteriously resolved. Each favor came with a simple request: attend a dinner party, deliver a sealed envelope, or simply remain silent about certain activities they might witness. But these favors were never free. Each act of assistance created what the network called spiritual debt, obligations that could only be repaid through increasingly compromising acts of service. The process could take years, with recruits gradually drawn deeper into the network's activities until they found themselves attending rituals in underground chambers, participating in blood oath ceremonies, and ultimately becoming fully initiated members of the shadow hierarchy. What made escape nearly impossible was the network's systematic collection of compromising evidence on every member. Hidden cameras captured ritual participation, financial records documented illegal transactions, and signed confessions were extracted during initiation ceremonies. Anyone who attempted to leave or expose the network would find their careers destroyed, their families threatened, and their darkest secrets exposed to the world. The network's communication system was equally sophisticated. They developed an elaborate code using seemingly innocent business correspondence, newspaper advertisements, and even church bulletin announcements. A grain futures report might actually contain instructions for a ritual gathering, while a wedding announcement could signal the need for a supernatural intervention in some distant location. Federal investigators eventually identified over 200 active network members spread across Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. These individuals held positions in banks, mining companies, timber operations, newspapers, law enforcement agencies, and government offices. They had created what amounted to a parallel power structure that could influence elections, manipulate markets, and control information flow across the entire Appalachian region. The network's supernatural activities had evolved far beyond the crude blood rituals of their mountain origins. By the 1950s, they were conducting elaborate ceremonies in purpose-built underground facilities hidden beneath legitimate businesses. These modern ritual chambers featured sophisticated ventilation systems, acoustic dampening, and even primitive recording equipment used to document their otherworldly communications. One such facility, discovered beneath a seemingly ordinary furniture store in Huntington, West Virginia, contained a ceremonial chamber capable of accommodating over 100 participants. The walls were lined with carved symbols that combined ancient Celtic designs with Native American pictographs and what appeared to be completely original mystical alphabets. The center of the chamber featured a raised platform with channels carved into the stone that led to a series of collection pools arranged in geometric patterns. More disturbing were the technological innovations the network had developed. They created specialized photographic equipment designed to capture what they called spiritual emanations during rituals. These photographs, hundreds of which were recovered during raids, showed ceremony participants surrounded by strange lights and shadow formations that seemed to move independently of the people casting them. The network had also developed sophisticated psychological conditioning techniques that went far beyond simple intimidation. They employed what modern experts would recognize as advanced mind control methods, using combinations of sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, and what they called essence transfer rituals to create absolutely loyal followers who would carry out orders without question. Perhaps most chilling was their systematic approach to identifying and recruiting children who showed what they termed spiritual sensitivity. Network families would carefully monitor local communities for children who displayed unusual abilities, unexplained knowledge, or what might today be recognized as psychic phenomena. These children would be gradually drawn into the network through seemingly innocent mentorship programs, after-school activities, and community organizations. The conditioning process for these young recruits was particularly sophisticated. Children would be exposed to increasingly strange experiences, beginning with simple meditation exercises and progressing to participation in minor rituals. By adolescence, many of these recruits had been so thoroughly conditioned that they viewed their supernatural experiences as completely normal and eagerly anticipated full initiation into the network's mysteries. Federal investigators discovered detailed records of this recruitment program, including psychological profiles of hundreds of children, training curricula for different age groups, and even standardized testing methods designed to identify children with the greatest potential for supernatural sensitivity. The systematic nature of this program suggested that the network was actively working to create successive generations of practitioners who would carry their traditions forward indefinitely. The network's influence on local culture was profound and lasting. They systematically promoted folk traditions, musical styles, and storytelling practices that served their purposes. Many of the ghost stories, folk songs, and regional legends that tourists associate with Appalachian culture were actually created or modified by network families to serve as coded communications, recruitment tools, or simply to normalize the supernatural elements of their practices. They established what appeared to be innocent cultural preservation societies, folk music festivals, and historical associations that were actually fronts for network activities. These organizations provided perfect cover for gathering large numbers of people, identifying potential recruits, and conducting ceremonies disguised as cultural celebrations. The network's economic influence extended far beyond their supernatural activities. They had created an extensive money laundering operation that moved profits from their various illegal enterprises through legitimate businesses across multiple states. Timber companies, mining operations, and manufacturing businesses all served as fronts for cleaning money generated through their occult services, protection rackets, and supernatural consultation fees. Their client base was surprisingly diverse and included wealthy industrialists, desperate farmers, ambitious politicians, and even rival criminal organizations who sought supernatural advantages in their own activities. The network offered a full range of services from simple fortune telling and protective charms to elaborate rituals designed to curse enemies, guarantee business success, or even allegedly extend life through dark bargains. The federal investigation ultimately revealed that the network had been operating as a shadow government across much of Appalachia for nearly 8 decades. They had their own system of laws, courts, and punishments that operated completely outside legitimate legal structures. Network members who violated internal rules faced tribunals conducted in underground chambers, with punishments ranging from public humiliation rituals to complete ostracism from the supernatural community. The most serious offenses against network law were punished by what they called spiritual severance, a ritual that allegedly cut the offender off from all supernatural protections and actively cursed them with misfortune. Several documented cases exist of former network members who suffered remarkable runs of bad luck, mysterious illnesses, and inexplicable accidents after being subjected to these punishment rituals. When the federal crackdown finally came in the late 1950s, the network's response was swift and coordinated. Within 48 hours of the first raids, hundreds of members had disappeared from their homes and businesses, leaving behind only empty houses and abandoned offices. Bank accounts were emptied, important documents were destroyed, and even graveyards associated with network families were found to have been systematically excavated. The few network members who were captured proved remarkably resistant to interrogation. Many seemed genuinely unable to discuss their activities, claiming that attempts to reveal network secrets caused them physical pain or mental confusion. Others insisted that their supernatural protections would prevent any legal proceedings from succeeding, and in several cases, key witnesses died under mysterious circumstances before they could testify. The aftermath of the federal raids left lasting scars across the Appalachian region. Entire communities found themselves economically devastated when network-controlled businesses suddenly closed. Local governments struggled to function after losing key personnel to the investigation, and many residents lived in fear that the network would eventually return to exact revenge on those who had cooperated with federal authorities. Even today, over 60 years after the main federal investigation, evidence suggests that remnants of the network continue to operate in the region. Modern law enforcement agencies occasionally encounter cases that bear the distinctive hallmarks of network activity: unexplained disappearances, ritualistic crime scenes, and witnesses who seem strangely reluctant to discuss what they've seen. The true extent of the children of the eternal harvest and their associated network may never be fully understood. The systematic destruction of evidence, the death or disappearance of key witnesses, and the network's sophisticated security measures have left investigators with more questions than answers. What remains certain is that for nearly a century, a shadow organization operated with impunity across one of America's most isolated regions, wielding supernatural beliefs as tools of power and control in ways that challenge our understanding of how such systems could exist in the modern world. The most chilling discovery came in 1962 when a team of federal investigators entered the abandoned compound of the Eternal Harvest in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. In the basement beneath what appeared to be an ordinary farmhouse, they found something that would haunt them for decades. Carved into the stone walls were thousands of names: men, women, children, all arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse in the flickering light of their flashlights. Each name was accompanied by a date and a single word: taken, transformed, consumed. What made this discovery truly terrifying wasn't just the sheer number of names. It was that many of them corresponded to missing persons reports spanning nearly 70 years. People who had vanished without a trace across 3 states. People whose disappearances had been dismissed as runaways or accidents. The investigators realized they were looking at evidence of something far more organized and systematic than anyone had imagined. This was the moment federal authorities understood they weren't dealing with isolated incidents of religious extremism. They were confronting a coordinated network that had been operating in plain sight for generations. A shadow infrastructure that had woven itself so deeply into Appalachian society that pulling it out would require dismantling entire communities. The investigation that followed would be called Operation Mountain Shadow. It would uncover connections between dozens of seemingly unrelated groups scattered across the mountain regions. Groups that shared coded communication systems, identical ritual practices, and most disturbing of all, a common leadership structure that remained frustratingly elusive. At the center of it all was a figure known only as the Shepherd. Never photographed, never recorded, but referenced in countless documents seized from raid sites. The Shepherd appeared to be the coordinating force behind what investigators termed the Appalachian Shadow Network, a confederation of cults, secret societies, and criminal organizations that had been sharing resources, information, and victims for decades. The Children of the Eternal Harvest was just one tentacle of this vast organism. Founded in 1889 by a former Methodist preacher named Ezekiel Thornweave, the group had started as a simple agricultural collective, families pooling resources to survive harsh mountain winters. But Thornweave had been exposed to certain texts during his seminary training, ancient manuscripts that had been hidden in the archives of a Virginia theological college since colonial times. These texts spoke of entities that existed in the spaces between worlds, beings that could be contacted through specific rituals involving blood sacrifice and what the documents called fleshwalking, the practice of temporarily housing these entities in human bodies during ceremonial rites. Thornweave became obsessed with the idea that these entities could grant his followers protection from poverty, disease, and death. The transformation of the collective began slowly. First came the dietary restrictions. Members were forbidden from consuming certain foods during specific lunar phases. Then came the bloodletting ceremonies, monthly gatherings where participants would make small cuts on their arms, allowing the blood to drip into wooden bowls that were later buried in the surrounding forest. As the rituals grew more elaborate, so did their effectiveness, at least from the perspective of the believers. Crops flourished even during drought years. Livestock remained healthy while neighboring farms suffered disease outbreaks. Children born into the collective demonstrated unusual abilities: enhanced night vision, uncanny intuition about weather patterns, and most unsettling of all, the ability to sense the presence of outsiders from remarkable distances. But these gifts came with a price that became apparent only gradually. Members began experiencing shared dreams, vivid nightmares featuring the same recurring imagery, dark forests where the trees had faces, underground chambers filled with whispering voices, and always the presence of something watching from just beyond the edge of perception. The collective's isolation deepened as members found it increasingly difficult to interact with the outside world. They spoke of feeling physically ill when traveling to nearby towns, of experiencing panic attacks in churches, of sensing a constant pull to return to their mountain sanctuary. They were becoming something other than human, though they wouldn't understand the full implications until it was far too late. By 1920, the Children of the Eternal Harvest had expanded to include over 300 members across 7 counties. They operated through a cell structure that would later be copied by more conventional criminal organizations. Each cell knew only its immediate neighbors in the network. Communications were passed through coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent correspondence about farming and weather conditions. The real breakthrough in understanding their operations came when investigators discovered the breeding program. The collective had been systematically arranging marriages and births to produce children with specific genetic markers, traits that enhanced psychic sensitivity and made individuals more suitable for what internal documents call deep communion with the outer presences. These children were raised in specialized facilities hidden throughout the mountains, underground complexes where they were subjected to years of conditioning designed to break down the barriers between their consciousness and what the collective believed were interdimensional entities. The process was called opening, and it left participants permanently changed. Former members who eventually escaped the collective described the opened children as simultaneously captivating and terrifying. They possessed an otherworldly charisma that made them natural leaders, but their eyes held a quality that suggested something else was looking out through them, something ancient and hungry. The collective used these opened individuals as recruiters, sending them to neighboring communities to identify potential converts. They had an uncanny ability to recognize people who were desperate, isolated, or psychologically vulnerable. They would offer help, friendship, and eventually an invitation to visit the collective's mountain retreat. Most visitors never returned. Those who did often brought back stories that local authorities dismissed as delusions or exaggerations. Tales of underground ceremonies where participants chanted in languages that predated human speech, of rituals involving the consumption of substances that caused temporary transformation of human flesh, of witnessing impossible things that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The few documented escapes from the collective revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that was decades ahead of its time. New members were gradually isolated from outside contacts through a combination of physical relocation and emotional conditioning. They were taught that the outside world was spiritually contaminated and that leaving the collective would result in immediate supernatural retribution. This conditioning was reinforced through carefully orchestrated experiences that appeared to validate the collective's supernatural claims. Newcomers would witness seemingly impossible events, healings that defied medical explanation, predictions that came true with uncanny accuracy, demonstrations of abilities that suggested the collective's leaders possessed genuine supernatural powers. What investigators eventually discovered was that many of these demonstrations were elaborate hoaxes made possible by the collective's extensive intelligence network. They had informants in hospitals, government offices, and law enforcement agencies throughout the region. This allowed them to stage miraculous healings by targeting individuals whose medical conditions they already knew about, to make accurate predictions by having advanced knowledge of planned events, to create the illusion of supernatural surveillance by having human watchers positioned throughout their territory. But not everything could be explained by conventional deception. Too many witnesses reported experiences that seemed to transcend the boundaries of normal reality. Former members spoke of participating in rituals where the participants' consciousness seemed to merge into a collective entity, of moments where they could perceive events happening miles away with perfect clarity, of encounters with beings that existed in a state somewhere between physical and spiritual reality. The collective's influence extended far beyond its official membership. They had cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and business leaders throughout the region, not through conventional corruption, but through a more subtle form of psychological manipulation. They would identify individuals in positions of power who harbored secret guilt, hidden desires, or unacknowledged fears. Then they would orchestrate situations that allowed them to offer exactly what these individuals needed most. A politician facing a career-ending scandal might receive anonymous information that discredited his accusers. A judge struggling with a family crisis might find that his problems mysteriously resolved themselves after a chance encounter with a collective member. A businessman on the verge of bankruptcy might receive an unexpected investment opportunity that saved his company. These interventions created a network of obligation and dependence that allowed the collective to operate with virtual impunity. Local law enforcement looked the other way when reports surfaced about strange activities in collective territory. State officials found reasons to avoid investigating complaints about missing persons. Federal agencies discovered that their inquiries were consistently hampered by bureaucratic obstacles and missing documentation. The collective's most ambitious project was something they called the Great Working. Documents seized during the 1962 raids revealed plans for a massive ritual designed to permanently thin the barriers between dimensions. The ceremony would require hundreds of participants and a specific astronomical alignment that occurred only once every few decades. The ritual was scheduled for the winter solstice of 1963. It would take place in a natural amphitheater deep in the mountains, where the collective had been preparing for over a year. They had carved elaborate symbols into the rock formations surrounding the site. They had redirected underground streams to flow in specific patterns. They had constructed a series of underground chambers where the most important participants would undergo final preparations. The Great Working was intended to create a permanent gateway that would allow the outer presences to enter our reality in physical form. According to the collective's theology, this would usher in a new age where the boundaries between human and divine consciousness would be permanently dissolved. Humanity would be transformed into something greater, though the documents were vague about what exactly this transformation would entail. Federal investigators realized they were facing a countdown to what could be either mass suicide or something far worse. The collective had been stockpiling supplies, weapons, and what appeared to be chemical compounds for months. They had been quietly moving members from distant cells to the central location. Most disturbing of all, they had been collecting what internal documents referred to as seed material from individuals with specific genetic markers. The decision was made to raid the site before the winter solstice ceremony could take place. Over 200 federal agents, state police, and National Guard members surrounded the collective's mountain stronghold in the early hours of December 20th, 1963. They expected to find a large gathering of cultists preparing for their ritual. Instead, they found empty buildings and cold campfires. The collective had vanished completely, leaving behind only their carved symbols and abandoned equipment. It was as if hundreds of people had simply stepped out of reality, taking nothing with them but disappearing so thoroughly that no trace of their passage remained. The investigation continued for months, but the trail had gone completely cold. No collective members were ever found. No witnesses came forward. No evidence surfaced to explain how such a large group could have vanished so completely. The official report concluded that the collective had received advance warning of the raid and had scattered to predetermined hiding places throughout the mountain wilderness. But some investigators suspected something more disturbing had occurred. They pointed to evidence that the collective had actually begun their ritual several days before the scheduled ceremony. Sensors placed around the site had detected unusual seismic activity. Temperature readings had shown inexplicable fluctuations. Most unsettling of all, several agents reported experiencing shared hallucinations during the initial approach to the compound. The truth about what happened to the children of the eternal harvest may never be fully known, but their influence on the broader Appalachian shadow network was undeniable. The organizational techniques they pioneered were adopted by other groups throughout the region. Their recruitment methods became standard practice for cults seeking to expand their membership. Their integration of genuine community service with darker hidden agendas provided a template that would be copied for decades. Even today, federal authorities maintain files on groups that exhibit characteristics similar to the original collective. Organizations that combine religious extremism with sophisticated psychological manipulation. Communities that demonstrate unusual prosperity despite their remote locations. Groups that maintain extensive intelligence networks and show signs of coordinated activity across multiple states. The mountains of Appalachia continue to harbor secrets that law enforcement agencies prefer not to discuss publicly. Missing persons cases that follow patterns eerily similar to those documented during the Shadow Network investigations. Reports of unusual phenomena that suggests some groups may have succeeded in practices that the children of the eternal harvest only attempted. Evidence that the network's influence may have survived the federal crackdowns and evolved into something even more sophisticated and dangerous. Local residents in certain areas still speak in whispers about families that seem to possess abilities that can't be explained by conventional means, about communities that maintain their traditions in ways that make outsiders deeply uncomfortable, about places in the mountains where the very air seems to carry a weight that presses against the mind and soul of anyone who ventures too close. The legacy of the Appalachian Shadow Network serves as a reminder that the isolation and independence that define mountain culture can sometimes conceal practices that challenge our understanding of human nature itself. In places where the outside world's influence has always been limited, it becomes possible for ideas and traditions to evolve in directions that civilized society would never permit. The federal investigations of the 1960s may have disrupted the network's operations, but they never fully eliminated its influence. Too many questions remain unanswered. Too many connections were never fully traced. The shadowy tendrils of these cult networks extended far deeper into modern Appalachian society than anyone dared imagine. While federal raids in the 1960s claimed to have dismantled their operations, what investigators discovered was far more disturbing than complete annihilation. They had found adaptation, evolution, the children of the eternal harvest, and their affiliated shadow groups hadn't been destroyed. They had simply learned to hide better. By the 1970s, whispers began circulating through mountain communities about something locals called the Quiet Revival. Unlike the dramatic ceremonies and overt rituals of previous decades, this new phase operated with surgical precision and corporate efficiency. The old symbols carved into trees were replaced with subtle markings on road signs. Ancient ritual sites were abandoned in favor of nondescript warehouses and renovated churches. The blood oaths continued, but now they were sealed in boardrooms rather than underground chambers. What made this transformation particularly chilling was how seamlessly it integrated with legitimate society. Former cult members who had supposedly renounced their practices were discovered decades later holding positions of influence in banks, school boards, and local government offices. Their children, raised in apparent normalcy, would mysteriously disappear for weekends during specific lunar cycles, returning with no memory of where they had been, but displaying knowledge they couldn't possibly have acquired through conventional means. The paper trail, when investigators could find one, painted a picture of staggering organizational sophistication. Shell companies with names like Mountain Heritage Foundation and Appalachian Cultural Preservation Society funneled millions of dollars into land acquisitions throughout the region. These properties, always purchased through intermediaries, shared common characteristics: remote locations, underground water sources, and geological formations that created natural acoustic amplification. Local real estate agents reported that buyers for these properties never viewed them in person, instead relying on surveys that focused heavily on subsurface features rather than above-ground structures. More disturbing were the employment patterns that emerged around these properties. Job listings would appear in regional newspapers for positions like groundskeeper, night security, or maintenance technician. The qualifications were always oddly specific: must be comfortable working alone, no family ties to the immediate area, and willing to sign extensive confidentiality agreements. Those who responded to these advertisements and were hired would work for exactly 13 months before either quitting abruptly or simply vanishing. Their final paychecks were always delivered to post office boxes that were subsequently abandoned. The psychological manipulation techniques pioneered by the original cults had evolved into something approaching scientific precision. Rather than relying on crude intimidation or supernatural theatrics, the modern incarnation employed methods that would make corporate behavioral psychologists envious. They identified vulnerable individuals through data mining of social services, bankruptcy records, and divorce proceedings. Targets were approached not by mysterious figures in robes, but by seemingly helpful neighbors offering employment opportunities or community support. The recruitment process was gradual and almost imperceptible. New members would be invited to community dinners that seemed perfectly normal except for subtle, ritualistic elements. Meals served at precisely calculated times, seating arrangements that formed specific geometric patterns, and conversations that gradually introduced concepts of spiritual awakening and collective consciousness. Attendees reported feeling unusually relaxed and open during these gatherings, though toxicology tests on those who later escaped showed traces of compounds that couldn't be identified by conventional analysis. Children remained a particular focus, but the methods had become far more sophisticated than the crude abductions of earlier decades. The network established what appeared to be legitimate youth programs, summer camps, after-school activities, and mentorship programs. These operations targeted children who displayed what the organization called special sensitivities, the same psychic potential that had always fascinated the cults. Parents were told their children had been selected for gifted programs or leadership development opportunities. The children would return from these experiences with improved academic performance and seemingly enhanced abilities, creating grateful families who never questioned the program's true nature. Former participants, who later broke free, described a systematic conditioning process that began with seemingly innocent activities. Children would be taught meditation techniques that were actually forms of self-hypnosis, opening their minds to external influence. They learned songs that contained subliminal messages and participated in trust exercises that gradually broke down psychological boundaries. By the time more overt indoctrination began, the children had been conditioned to accept increasingly strange experiences as normal. The most chilling aspect of this modern evolution was how the network had learned to exploit technology while maintaining their mystical practices. They established encrypted communication networks that allowed coordinations across vast distances. Ritual ceremonies were live-streamed to members who couldn't attend in person, creating a sense of collective participation even when physically separated. They used social media algorithms to identify potential recruits and sophisticated data analysis to predict law enforcement activities. Yet despite this technological sophistication, the core supernatural elements remained unchanged and, if anything, had grown stronger. Members reported that the entities they communed with seemed to have adapted to the modern world as well. Instead of appearing as traditional demonic figures, these beings now manifested in forms that reflected contemporary fears: shadowy figures in business suits, voices speaking through electronic devices, and presences that seem to inhabit digital networks as easily as physical spaces. The ritual practices had evolved but retained their essential character. The blood offerings continued, though now they were collected through what appeared to be routine medical procedures. Members were required to undergo regular health screenings that included blood draws supposedly for wellness monitoring. These samples were actually used in ceremonies conducted at remote facilities where the blood was combined with other elements in rituals designed to maintain the supernatural contracts that bound the organization together. Property records revealed that the network had acquired numerous medical facilities throughout Appalachia, small clinics, blood banks, and even portions of larger hospitals. Staff at these facilities reported unusual protocols for certain patients, particularly those with rare blood types or specific genetic markers. Samples that should have been discarded after testing were instead transferred to unmarked vehicles that arrived at precisely scheduled times. When questioned, supervisors would produce documentation authorizing these transfers, though the paperwork invariably disappeared from files shortly afterward. The breeding programs that had horrified investigators in earlier decades had evolved into something that appeared almost respectable on the surface. The network operated what seemed to be legitimate fertility clinics and adoption agencies throughout the region. Women seeking fertility treatments would be steered toward specific procedures that involved genetic screening and modification techniques that were supposedly cutting-edge medical advances. Children born through these programs displayed the enhanced psychic abilities the cults had always prized, but now these traits were explained as genetic advantages rather than supernatural gifts. Adoption records showed suspicious patterns of children being placed with families who all lived within specific geographic areas and shared certain genealogical connections. Follow-up studies revealed that these adopted children maintained contact with their birth families through programs described as cultural heritage preservation. In reality, these connections ensured that children with desired traits remained connected to the network, regardless of their official family placements. The economic influence wielded by the modern network dwarfed anything achieved by their predecessors. They had learned to manipulate markets not through crude intimidation, but through sophisticated financial instruments and information networks. Companies throughout Appalachia found themselves dependent on contracts with firms that were ultimately controlled by network members. Local banks discovered that their most profitable investment opportunities came through brokers who were connected to the organization. Politicians found their campaigns funded by donors whose generosity came with subtle but unmistakable expectations. This economic control created a web of dependence that made exposure or resistance extremely difficult. Anyone who attempted to investigate or oppose the network found their businesses facing unexpected regulatory problems, their loans called in without warning, or their family members encountering difficulties in employment or education. The pressure was never applied directly enough to constitute obvious criminal activity, but the message was unmistakable. Cooperation was rewarded, resistance was punished. Law enforcement agencies found themselves systematically compromised through this economic influence. Officers discovered that promotions and assignments were influenced by their willingness to overlook certain activities or avoid investigating specific properties. Judges found that their most significant cases involved legal arguments prepared by attorneys who seemed unusually well informed about judicial preferences and decision making patterns. Prosecutors learned that their most important investigations faced budget cuts or administrative obstacles that could only be resolved through accommodation with powerful local interests. The network's infiltration of educational institutions was particularly sophisticated. They established scholarship programs that identified promising students and guided them toward careers in law enforcement, government, and business. These students received excellent educations and graduated without any apparent connection to cult activities. Only years later, when they had achieved positions of influence, would they be contacted by mentors who gradually revealed the true nature of their benefactors and the expectations that came with their success. Universities throughout the region found their research programs influenced by grants from foundations with innocuous names but carefully directed agendas. Archaeological departments received funding for excavations that were actually searches for ritual sites. Psychology programs developed studies of group dynamics and social influence that provided insights useful for manipulation and control. Medical schools conducted research into genetic markers and blood chemistry that advanced the network's understanding of the traits they sought to cultivate and preserve. The supernatural elements of the network's activities had not diminished despite their modern sophistication. If anything, the combination of ancient practices with contemporary resources had amplified their occult capabilities. Members reported that the entities they served had grown stronger and more present as the network expanded its influence. The rituals conducted in modern facilities were more elaborate and effective than anything achieved in crude mountain caves or forest clearings. These ceremonies now incorporated technology in ways that would have been impossible for earlier generations. Sound systems created acoustic effects that enhanced the psychological impact of chanted invocations. Lighting systems produced visual displays that seemed to open windows into otherworldly realms. Computer-controlled environmental systems maintained precise atmospheric conditions that facilitated supernatural manifestations. Video recording equipment captured phenomena that defied conventional explanation, creating archives of supernatural evidence that served both as proof of the network's power and as tools for indoctrinating new members. The most disturbing reports came from individuals who had escaped the network after years of involvement. They described facilities where the boundary between physical and spiritual reality seemed to have dissolved entirely. Rooms where shadows moved independently of their sources, where temperatures fluctuated without any mechanical cause, and where electronic equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested intelligent interference rather than random failure. These witnesses spoke of meetings where human participants were outnumbered by entities that were clearly not human, beings that provided guidance and direction for the network's activities while demanding increasingly elaborate forms of worship and sacrifice. The sacrificial practices had evolved to avoid the detection that had plagued earlier generations while maintaining their supernatural effectiveness. Instead of dramatic ritual murders, that left obvious evidence. The network had learned to orchestrate deaths that appeared natural or accidental. Members with medical training would identify individuals whose deaths could be attributed to existing health conditions. Others with access to industrial equipment would arrange workplace accidents that eliminated threats to the organization. Still others would create situations where targets would suffer fatal accidents that appeared to be the result of the dangerous mountain environment. These deaths were always carefully timed to coincide with astrological events or ritual calendars that maintained the supernatural contracts binding the network together. Victims were selected not randomly, but according to specific criteria. Genetic markers that made their life force particularly valuable, personal connections to individuals the network wished to influence, or simply the symbolic value of their deaths in maintaining the climate of fear that protected the organization from investigation. The network's influence extended far beyond the boundaries of Appalachia through connections with similar organizations in other regions. Investigators had discovered evidence of coordination with groups in the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest desert regions, and even urban areas where ancient bloodlines had established new strongholds. These connections suggested that what appeared to be a regional phenomenon was actually part of a much larger pattern of occult influence that spanned the entire continent. Communication between these distant cells occurred through channels that combined modern encryption with traditional occult practices. Messages were embedded in seemingly innocent business correspondence, academic papers, and even social media posts using codes that incorporated both mathematical algorithms and mystical symbolism. The network had learned to hide their communications in plain sight, using the vast volume of digital information to conceal their coordination efforts. The ultimate goals of this expanded network remained consistent with those of their predecessors, but had grown in scope and ambition. They continued to work toward what they called the Great Working, a ritual of continental scope designed to thin the barriers between dimensions and allow their otherworldly allies to establish a more direct presence in the physical world. Modern technology had made coordination of such a massive undertaking feasible in ways that would have been impossible for earlier generations. Preparations for this ultimate ritual were evident in the network's systematic acquisition of properties at locations that formed geometric patterns across vast distances. These sites, when mapped, revealed alignments that incorporated both geographical features and artificial structures in ways that created what the network believed would be a continental-scale magical apparatus. The positioning of cell towers, the routing of fiber optic cables, and even the placement of wind farms had been influenced by network members working within telecommunications and energy companies to create infrastructure that would serve both mundane and occult purposes. The timeline for this great working remained unclear, but evidence suggested it was tied to astronomical events that occurred only at intervals of decades or centuries. Network documents referred to approaching celestial alignments that would create optimal conditions for their ultimate ritual. The specific date remained hidden in coded references, but the sense of anticipation and preparation was unmistakable in communications intercepted by investigators. As this modern phase of the Appalachian Shadow Network continued to evolve and expand, the question remained whether conventional law enforcement and governmental institutions possess the resources and understanding necessary to confront a threat that operated simultaneously in physical, psychological, and supernatural dimensions. The network had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors and adapted their methods to exploit the vulnerabilities of contemporary society while maintaining the ancient practices that were the source of their power. The mountains of Appalachia continue to hold their secrets, but now those secrets have learned to walk among us in boardrooms and classrooms, hospitals, and government offices. The ancient hunger that once hid in remote hollows now wears suits and carries briefcases, speaks in corporate jargon and academic terminology, but remains fundamentally unchanged in its appetite for power and its willingness to pay any price to achieve its ultimate goals. The truth is, these families were just the beginning. By the 1940s, what started as isolated bloodline practices had evolved into something far more organized and terrifying. Federal investigators discovered that several of these ritual practicing clans had been quietly networking for decades, sharing techniques, trading resources, and most disturbingly coordinating their activities across state lines. They called it the Appalachian Shadow Network, and its reach extended far beyond anything authorities had imagined. The network operated through a system of coded communications embedded in seemingly innocent activities. Barn raisings, church socials, and harvest festivals became cover for gatherings where representatives from different bloodlines would meet. They developed an intricate language of symbols carved into fence posts, arranged in stone patterns, and woven into traditional crafts sold at local markets. A particular arrangement of corn husks on a porch might signal that a ritual site was active. Specific quilt patterns indicated which families were seeking new members or had resources available for trade. What they were trading wasn't money or goods, it was knowledge. The Blackburns shared their skinwalking techniques with the Thornhills, who in return taught them methods for emotional harvesting. The Stillwaters provided consciousness transfer protocols to the Crenshaws, receiving in exchange protective ward techniques that had kept their territories hidden for generations. Each family contributed their specialized expertise to a growing collective understanding of forces that mainstream society couldn't even acknowledge existed. The Shadow Network's most ambitious project began in 1952 with the establishment of what they called anchor points. These were locations strategically placed throughout the Appalachian region where multiple families would collaborate to create permanent gateways between their individual territories and something they referred to only as the Deep Country. Unlike the temporary access points individual families had maintained, these anchor points were designed to remain permanently active, allowing for rapid movement of people, resources, and entities across vast distances. Construction of each anchor point required contributions from at least 5 different bloodlines. The Rayburns provided their listening expertise to locate geologically suitable sites where the boundary between worlds was naturally thin. The Crenshaws contributed their protective objects, which were incorporated into the foundations of structures built at each location. The Blackwoods supplied blood-binding rituals that linked each anchor point to the others, creating a network that functioned as a single interconnected system. The Stillwaters offered consciousness transfer techniques that allowed designated operators to maintain awareness of activity across all points simultaneously. By 1960, the network had established 17 anchor points stretching from western Pennsylvania to northern Georgia. Each appeared to outsiders as an abandoned homestead, a forgotten mining operation, or a derelict logging camp. In reality, these locations hummed with activity that defied conventional understanding. Families could travel between points in ways that bypassed normal geography entirely, emerging from a basement in Kentucky moments after entering a cave in Tennessee. Resources could be shared instantaneously, with materials placed at one anchor point appearing at another within hours. More disturbing were reports of what the families called borrowing. Network operators discovered they could temporarily access abilities and knowledge from any bloodline connected to the system. A Thornhill could suddenly exhibit the Blackburn gift for tracking prey across impossible terrain. A Crenshaw might briefly demonstrate the Stillwater ability to transfer consciousness. These borrowed abilities came with a cost, however. Extended use resulted in permanent changes to the borrower's physiology and psychology, creating hybrid individuals who no longer fully belonged to their original bloodlines. The network's influence began extending beyond the mountain regions through what investigators later termed cultural infiltration. Network families started deliberately marrying into communities in surrounding areas, carrying their practices and loyalties into previously unaffected regions. They established legitimate businesses that provided cover for their activities while giving them economic influence in local communities. Logging companies, mining operations, and agricultural suppliers controlled by network families created webs of dependency that made entire towns complicit in maintaining their secrecy. Educational infiltration proved particularly effective. Network families prioritized placing their members in teaching positions, especially in rural schools, where they could identify children who showed particular sensitivity to their practices. These children would be gradually introduced to network activities through seemingly innocent cultural programs focusing on local history and traditional crafts. By the time parents realized what was happening, their children had already undergone preliminary conditioning that made them eager participants in network activities. The breakthrough that exposed the true scope of the shadow network came in 1963 when a former member named Elizabeth Crenshaw contacted federal authorities after fleeing the network following a ritual that killed her younger sister. Her detailed testimony revealed that the anchor points were not just transportation and communication hubs, but active summoning sites where the families worked collectively to maintain contact with entities from what she described as parallel versions of Appalachia, where different evolutionary paths had been taken. According to Crenshaw's account, these entities were not supernatural in the traditional sense, but rather inhabitants of alternate realities where human development had taken radically different paths. Some had evolved enhanced physical capabilities through symbiotic relationships with mountain ecosystems. Others had developed collective consciousness that allowed them to function as hive minds spanning entire watersheds. Most disturbing were those that had abandoned physical form entirely, existing as pure intention and hunger that could only manifest through willing human hosts. The network's ultimate goal, Crenshaw claimed, was not just communication with these entities, but gradual merger. Each ritual performed at the anchor points created micro tears in the boundary between realities, allowing small amounts of influence to seep through. Over decades, this accumulated influence was changing the fundamental nature of the Appalachian region itself. Wildlife was exhibiting unnatural behaviors. Plant growth followed patterns that defied botanical understanding. Even the geology was slowly shifting in ways that created natural formations resembling the ritual sites the families had been constructing. Federal response to Crenshaw's revelations was swift and massive. The operation targeted all 17 known anchor points simultaneously, hoping to prevent network families from coordinating a response or evacuating through their transportation system. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The anchor points were not simply ritual sites, but functioning industrial operations producing materials and technologies that shouldn't have existed. Underground workshops contained precision instruments carved from unknown minerals that demonstrated properties suggesting advanced understanding of physics and chemistry. Storage areas held preserved biological specimens from species that didn't match any known taxonomy. Most unsettling were the communication devices that appeared to be organic growths shaped into technological configurations, pulsing with their own light and responding to human presence with sounds that analysis suggested might be attempts at language. The human cost became apparent as teams penetrated deeper into the network's infrastructure. They discovered holding areas where dozens of individuals from outside the region were being kept in various states of consciousness. Some appeared to be undergoing the same consciousness transfer procedures the Stillwaters had perfected, but on an industrial scale. Others showed signs of the physical modifications associated with Blackburn practices, though far more extreme than anything previously documented. Medical examination revealed that many subjects had been surgically altered using techniques that shouldn't have been possible with available technology, yet showed healing patterns indicating the procedures had been successful. Most disturbing were the children. Each anchor point contained educational facilities where network offspring were undergoing accelerated development programs that combined traditional academic instruction with training in their families' specialized practices. These children demonstrated capabilities that defied conventional understanding of human potential. They could navigate in complete darkness with perfect accuracy, communicate over vast distances without technological assistance, and most unnervingly, seemed to possess shared memories that included experiences from before their births. The network's response to the federal raid demonstrated the true extent of their capabilities. Rather than attempting escape or resistance, they simply vanished, not individually, but collectively and simultaneously across all 17 sites. One moment, federal teams were documenting evidence and detaining suspects. The next, every network member had disappeared, leaving behind only their modified captives and confused outsiders who had no memory of how they had arrived at the locations. Investigation of the disappearance revealed that the network had activated what Crenshaw had called the Deep Country Protocol. Every anchor point showed evidence of massive energy discharge that had somehow transported its occupants to locations that couldn't be determined through conventional tracking methods. More unsettling, the anchor points themselves had been fundamentally altered. What had been underground facilities were now filled with solid rock, as though the spaces had never existed. Surface structures showed accelerated aging that made them appear to have been abandoned for decades rather than hours. The aftermath of Operation Mountain Sweep created more questions than answers. The rescued captives, once recovered from their various modifications, reported memories of experiences that couldn't be reconciled with known geography or physics. They described vast underground cities connected by tunnels that stretched for hundreds of miles, populated by communities that blended human and non-human characteristics in ways that suggested long-term cohabitation rather than recent experimentation. They spoke of educational systems that taught sciences based on principles that conventional researchers couldn't verify or understand. More troubling were reports from the rescued children. Despite extensive psychological evaluation and treatment, they continued to demonstrate the enhanced capabilities they had developed during their time with the network. They could predict weather patterns weeks in advance with perfect accuracy, navigate through unfamiliar wilderness areas as though following invisible maps. And most concerning, they maintained the ability to communicate with each other across vast distances through methods that electronic surveillance couldn't detect or intercept. Federal authorities attempted to suppress information about Operation Mountain Sweep, but rumors persisted throughout the region. Local communities reported strange phenomena in the months following the raid. Livestock exhibited unusual behaviors, gathering in geometric patterns that resembled the symbols found at network sites. Hunters discovered clearings where vegetation grew in configurations that matched the ritual circles documented at the anchor points. Most disturbing were reports of voices heard in the mountains during certain weather conditions, speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, but which seemed hauntingly familiar to those who heard them. The network's disappearance didn't end their influence. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, federal investigators documented incidents that suggested continued network activity, though in forms adapted to avoid detection. Missing persons cases in Appalachian regions showed patterns consistent with network recruitment methods. Archaeological sites throughout the mountains were found disturbed in ways that indicated systematic removal of specific artifacts. Most concerning, several legitimate businesses and educational institutions reported cyber intrusions that accessed databases containing information about genetics research, consciousness studies, and theoretical physics. By the 1990s, it became clear that the shadow network had not been destroyed, but had instead evolved into something far more sophisticated. Rather than maintaining fixed locations that could be targeted by authorities, they had adopted a distributed model that embedded their activities within mainstream society. Network members now worked within universities, research institutions, and technology companies, using their positions to advance understanding of the principles underlying their traditional practices while recruiting new members from among colleagues who showed interest in their research. The digital age provided unprecedented opportunities for network expansion. Internet communities focused on consciousness research, alternative archaeology, and fringe physics became recruitment grounds where network members could identify individuals with the intellectual curiosity and social isolation that made them ideal candidates for introduction to network activities. Online forums discussing Appalachian folklore and history served as testing grounds where potential recruits could be evaluated based on their responses to carefully crafted stories that contained coded references to network practices and beliefs. Modern network operations demonstrate a level of integration with contemporary society that makes detection and intervention extremely difficult. They have established foundations that fund research into consciousness transfer, genetic modification, and quantum physics while maintaining the appearance of legitimate scientific inquiry. Their members hold positions in government agencies responsible for monitoring unconventional threats, allowing them to redirect investigations away from network activities while gathering intelligence about official responses to their operations. The true scope of current network influence became apparent in 2019 when a data breach at a major technology company revealed communications between employees that contained the same symbolic language federal investigators had documented at anchor points in the 1960s. Further investigation revealed that several breakthrough technologies in quantum computing and biotechnology had been developed by teams that included individuals with documented connections to network families. These technologies demonstrated capabilities that official scientific understanding suggested shouldn't have been possible, raising questions about whether conventional technological development was being supplemented by knowledge derived from network practices. Perhaps most concerning are reports from the rescued network children, now adults, who maintain that their former captors never actually disappeared. According to these individuals, the network simply relocated to operational areas that exist parallel to conventional reality, accessible through methods that authorities still don't understand. They claim that network activities continue on a scale far exceeding anything documented during Operation Mountain Sweep, and that the ultimate goals of consciousness merger and reality manipulation are closer to achievement than ever before. Current evidence suggests that the Appalachian Shadow Network represents something unprecedented in American history, a multi-generational conspiracy that has successfully adapted traditional occult practices to modern technological capabilities while maintaining operational security that defeats conventional law enforcement methods. Their activities continue to influence events throughout the region and beyond, hidden within the infrastructure of contemporary society, but guided by principles and objectives that predate European settlement of North America. The mountains keep their secrets, but the families who learned to harness those secrets have never stopped working toward goals that most people couldn't imagine, let alone comprehend. They walk among us now, no longer isolated in remote hollows, but integrated into every level of society, carrying forward traditions that blur the line between ancient wisdom and modern nightmare. But what happens when ancient bloodlines refuse to die? When the very mountains themselves become complicit in preserving traditions that should have ended centuries ago? The Shadow Network may have been scattered, its leadership dismantled, but the deeper truth about Appalachia's supernatural legacy lies not in organized cults, but in something far more insidious. Family bloodlines that made their own individual bargains with forces older than human memory. Contracts written in blood that bind generation after generation to obligations they never chose but cannot escape. These weren't members of the grand network we've been exploring. These were independent operators, families who discovered their own pathways to power, prosperity, and survival in the harsh mountain wilderness. And unlike the organized cults that eventually drew government attention, these bloodline contracts were designed to appear perfectly normal, hiding their supernatural obligations behind the veneer of ordinary Appalachian life. What makes these family curses particularly terrifying is their subtlety. No mass rituals, no underground chambers, no obvious signs of occult activity. Just families who seem to have unusual luck, unexplained prosperity, or remarkable talents that pass down through generations. But prosperity always demands payment, and in the mountains, that payment was extracted in ways that would make the organized cults seem almost merciful by comparison. The Hartwell prosperity curse emerged from desperation during the brutal winter of 1903. Samuel Hartwell watched his family slowly starve in their remote Kentucky hollow, his children growing weaker each day as their meager food supplies dwindled. The nearest town was a 3-day journey through treacherous mountain passes, and Samuel knew his youngest wouldn't survive the trip. On the winter solstice, as snow fell in sheets that seemed to muffle all sound, Samuel discovered something that would change his family's fate forever. Behind his cabin, where he'd been splitting firewood, his axe struck something metallic buried beneath the frozen earth. Digging frantically, he uncovered a small iron box, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light of his lantern. Inside the box lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with entries in multiple handwritings, spanning what appeared to be decades. Each entry followed the same pattern: a name, a desperate request, and a price paid. The final entry was dated 50 years earlier, written in a shaking hand: "The mountain remembers, the mountain provides." Samuel understood instinctively what he'd found. This was a record of bargains, a supernatural accounting book maintained by something that had been accepting desperate pleas for generations. With his family dying and no other options available, Samuel added his own entry: "Samuel Hartwell, my family needs prosperity." By spring, the Hartwell family's fortunes had transformed dramatically. Samuel discovered a rich vein of coal on his property that hadn't existed before. Buyers appeared from distant cities, offering prices far above market value. Their small farm began producing crops that grew larger and more abundant than anything their neighbors could achieve. Within 5 years, the Hartwells had become one of the wealthiest families in 3 counties. But the price revealed itself gradually, woven into the fabric of their daily lives in ways that seemed almost natural. Every generation of Hartwells would lose exactly 1 child before their 5th birthday. These children would simply wander away from the family home, drawn by something only they could see or hear, walking into the forest never to return. Search parties would find no trace, no signs of struggle, nothing but tiny footprints that led to the exact spot where Samuel had discovered the iron box, then simply vanished. The surviving family members learned not to speak of these disappearances to outsiders, not because they were threatened, but because something inside them made the words impossible to say. Their tongues would grow heavy, their throats would close, and they would find themselves talking about the weather instead. The Hartwell prosperity continued for over a century, passed down through generations who understood the cost but found themselves unable to break the cycle. They tried leaving the mountains, but family members who attempted to relocate would experience a slow, wasting disease that only lifted when they returned to the family land. They tried selling the property, but potential buyers would suffer inexplicable accidents or financial disasters that made the sales impossible. The last known Hartwell descendant, Margaret, attempted to break the curse in 1987 by destroying the iron box. She gathered her 3 young children and drove to the discovery site, determined to end the cycle of sacrifice. Local authorities found her car abandoned at the edge of the forest, the iron box sitting undamaged on the hood. Margaret and her children had vanished, but the box had reappeared, adding 4 new entries in familiar handwriting. Payment received in full. The Hartwell property remains in the family trust, managed by distant relatives who have never set foot on the land. Local real estate agents refuse to show the property, claiming their GPS systems malfunction in the area and their vehicles experience mysterious breakdowns. The coal mine continues to produce high-quality coal, despite geological surveys indicating the seam should have been exhausted decades ago. The Blackwood musical dynasty represents perhaps the most seductive form of supernatural contract, where the price seemed almost worth paying. In 1912, 15-year-old Thomas Blackwood possessed a beautiful singing voice that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who heard him perform at local church gatherings. But beautiful wasn't enough for Thomas, who dreamed of performing on stages far beyond the isolated mountain community where he'd been born. The opportunity came during a terrible drought that had lasted 3 months, killing crops and drying up wells throughout the region. Thomas's family faced starvation along with their neighbors, and it seemed like God himself had abandoned their mountain community. On the night of the new moon, Thomas climbed to the highest peak in the area, a barren summit locals called Sorrow's Crown, and sang his heart out to the empty sky. What answered wasn't God, but something far older. The voice that responded came from the mountain itself, a harmony that transformed Thomas's simple church hymn into something that seemed to contain all the music that had ever existed. The entity that dwelt within Sorrow's Crown offered Thomas a bargain. His family line would possess musical abilities beyond human comprehension, voices and instrumental skills that would bring them fame and fortune, but each generation would be required to give one performance for the mountain itself. Thomas accepted eagerly, thinking he understood the terms. Within months, his voice had developed qualities that defied explanation. He could sing notes that shouldn't exist, harmonize with himself in ways that created impossible acoustic effects, and compose melodies that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate in the listener's soul. Record executives traveled from Nashville and New York to hear the mountain boy whose voice was already becoming legendary. The Blackwood family rose to national prominence over the following decades. Each generation produced musicians whose abilities bordered on the supernatural. They could play instruments they'd never seen before, compose symphonies in their sleep, and perform concerts that left audiences weeping for reasons they couldn't articulate. The family's recordings became treasured possessions, passed down through families like precious heirlooms. But the true price of their gift only became apparent when family members attempted to retire from music or pursue other careers. Any Blackwood who stopped performing would begin to hear music constantly, day and night, melodies so complex and beautiful that they became a form of torture. They would lose the ability to sleep, eat, or function normally until they returned to their instruments. The music in their heads would grow louder and more demanding, driving them to the edge of madness until they capitulated. The required performance for the mountain revealed itself as something far more sinister than Thomas had anticipated. Every 7 years, the entire Blackwood family would be compelled to return to Sorrow's Crown for a concert unlike any other. They would play and sing for an audience they couldn't see but could feel watching from the darkness beyond their small circle of light. The music they performed during these mountain concerts was never the same as their public performances. Instead, they found themselves playing compositions that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, complex pieces that their conscious minds couldn't possibly have created. Local hikers reported strange phenomena during these concerts. Electronics would malfunction for miles around, animals would flee the area entirely, and the aurora borealis would sometimes appear in the southern sky, something that should have been meteorologically impossible. Most disturbing were the reports of people hearing the Blackwood concerts from impossible distances, sometimes hundreds of miles away. The music carried on winds that seemed to blow in all directions simultaneously. The family tried to break their contract in 1978 when the youngest Blackwood, 16-year-old Sarah, refused to participate in the mountain concert. She had discovered journal entries from previous generations describing the psychological toll of their supernatural abilities and had convinced her family to abandon their musical careers entirely. For 3 months, the family lived in relative peace, believing they had successfully freed themselves from their obligation. Then the silence began, not the absence of sound, but something far worse, a presence that absorbed all music from their lives. Radios would emit only static in their presence. Musical instruments would produce no sound when they touched them, and even the natural music of birds singing or wind through trees would cease when they approached. The world became unnaturally quiet around them, as if their rejection of the contract had created a dead zone where music couldn't exist. Sarah was the first to break. After weeks of living in this acoustic void, she climbed to Sorrow's Crown alone and performed a solo concert that lasted from sunset to sunrise. Hikers camping miles away reported hearing her voice echoing through the mountains for hours, singing songs in languages that predated human speech. When she finally descended the mountain, her hair had turned completely white and her eyes reflected light like mirrors. The family's musical abilities returned, but Sarah never spoke again. She communicated only through music, playing piano compositions that seemed to tell stories of things existing in the spaces between notes. She lived for another 40 years, performing constantly, her fingers moving across piano keys even in her sleep. When she finally died in 2018, her funeral was attended by thousands of people who had been drawn to the service by dreams of music they couldn't quite remember upon waking. The Blackwood musical dynasty continues today, though the family has become increasingly reclusive. Their public performances are rare and highly sought after, with tickets selling for thousands of dollars within minutes of being announced. But those who attend report that the concerts feel more like religious experiences than entertainment, with audience members frequently fainting or experiencing visions during the performances. The family's recording studio, built at the base of Sorrow's crown, operates under unusual conditions. Sessions can only be conducted during specific lunar phases. All equipment must be blessed with water from a particular mountain spring, and no recording can be made without leaving a small offering of blood on the studio's threshold. Music industry professionals who work with the Blackwoods sign extensive non-disclosure agreements, though many report that they find themselves physically unable to discuss the details of the recording process even when they want to. The Crawford healing gift emerged from the most maternal of instincts, making it perhaps the most tragic of all the bloodline curses. In 1923, Rebecca Crawford was a young mother living in an isolated West Virginia hollow when her infant son contracted pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. With no doctor within 100 miles and no way to transport a sick baby through the mountain passes, Rebecca faced the agonizing reality of watching her child die. In desperation, she carried her fevered son to a natural spring that local folklore claimed had healing properties. The spring emerged from a cave decorated with Native American petroglyphs depicting figures that seemed to be dancing around representations of the sun and moon. Rebecca had always dismissed such stories as superstition, but with her child dying in her arms, she was willing to try anything. As she knelt beside the spring, bathing her son's burning forehead with the cold water, Rebecca felt a presence emerging from the cave. She couldn't see anything clearly, but the shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, and she heard a voice that seemed to come from the water itself. The entity offered her a bargain. Her bloodline would possess the ability to heal any illness or injury, but each act of healing would transfer the ailment to the healer temporarily, and one member of each generation would be required to serve as a permanent vessel for the accumulated suffering of all those they had helped. Rebecca accepted without hesitation, and her son's fever broke within hours. But as his health returned, she began experiencing the symptoms of pneumonia herself. For 3 days, she suffered everything her child had endured, her lungs filling with fluid, her body racked with fever and chills. On the 4th day, the symptoms vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving her weak but alive. Word of the miraculous healing spread through the mountain communities, and soon people were traveling for days to seek Rebecca's help. She discovered that her healing abilities extended far beyond simple illnesses. She could mend broken bones with a touch, cure diseases that had baffled doctors, and even help those suffering from mental ailments. But each healing came with its price. Rebecca would experience the full extent of her patient's suffering, compressed into a few days of intense agony. The Crawford family's reputation as healers grew over the generations, with each inheriting the gift, along with its terrible cost. They learned to prepare for the suffering they would endure, setting aside days for recovery after particularly difficult healings. The family developed their own medical knowledge, becoming expert diagnosticians who could identify ailments that traditional medicine missed entirely. But the true horror of their curse revealed itself in the form of the vessel, the family member chosen in each generation to bear the permanent burden of accumulated suffering. The vessels were always identified in childhood, marked by their ability to sense illness in others and their unusual tolerance for pain. As they grew older, they would begin manifesting symptoms of every disease, injury, and mental ailment that their family had ever healed. The vessels lived in constant agony, their bodies and minds bearing the weight of centuries of human suffering. They aged rapidly, their hair turning white before their 20th birthday, their skin marked with scars from injuries they had never received. Most disturbing was their psychological state. They experienced the memories and emotions of every person their family had healed, carrying the accumulated trauma of thousands of individuals. Despite their suffering, the vessels played a crucial role in the family's healing practice. They could diagnose illnesses by proximity alone, their bodies resonating with the ailments of others. They could also absorb particularly severe conditions that might otherwise kill the active healers, serving as a supernatural buffer that allowed the family to attempt more dangerous healing work. The current generation's vessel, 23-year-old David Crawford, represents the culmination of over a century of accumulated suffering. He lives in a specially constructed cabin deep in the West Virginia mountains, tended by family members who wrote caring for him in shifts. Visitors describe him as appearing to be simultaneously ancient and young, his face bearing the wisdom of ages, while his body remains physically in its 20s. David rarely speaks, but when he does, his words carry the weight of profound understanding. He can predict natural disasters days in advance, sense the emotional state of people hundreds of miles away, and provide insights into human nature that seem to come from experiencing every possible form of human suffering. Medical researchers have attempted to study his condition, but their equipment malfunctions in his presence, and they find themselves overwhelmed by empathetic responses that leave them emotionally shattered. The Crawford family continues their healing practice, though they have become increasingly selective about the cases they accept. They focus primarily on children and young people, believing that the innocent deserve their help, regardless of the cost to themselves. Their services are provided free of charge, but they accept donations that help support David's care and maintain the family's isolated mountain compound. The healing spring that started their family's curse remains active, though access to it is now carefully controlled. The cave behind the spring has been sealed with a heavy iron gate, though family members report that the shadows still move independently behind the bars, and the voice of the entity that made the original bargain can still be heard whispering from the depths during the darkest nights of winter. These bloodline curses represent something far more insidious than the organized cults we've explored in previous episodes. Where the cults could be infiltrated, exposed, and dismantled by government intervention, these family contracts operate on a supernatural level that defies conventional investigation. They're woven into the very fabric of Appalachian life, disguised as natural talents, unusual luck, or family traditions that have been passed down for generations. What makes them particularly terrifying is their self-perpetuating nature. Unlike cult members who chose to join an organization, these families are bound by contracts made by desperate ancestors, trapped in cycles of supernatural obligation that they didn't choose but cannot escape. Each generation inherits not just the benefits of their family's bargain, but also the terrible prices that must be paid to maintain them. The entities that enforce these contracts seem to operate on a different level of reality than the dark forces we've encountered in previous episodes. They're not interested in worship, political influence, or grand supernatural schemes. Instead, They appear to be ancient forces that feed on human desperation, offering solutions to impossible problems in exchange for binding agreements that stretch across generations. Local authorities in Appalachian communities have learned to recognize the signs of these bloodline curses, though they rarely discuss them openly. Families with unusual prosperity, unexplained talents, or patterns of tragedy that repeat across generations are quietly monitored by local law enforcement and social services. But intervention is nearly impossible, as the families themselves are often unaware of the supernatural nature of their situations, believing their circumstances to be natural family traits or simply unusual luck. The most chilling aspect of these bloodline curses is their apparent permanence. Unlike the cults that could be disbanded or the networks that could be exposed, these family contracts seem to be written into the very essence of the mountain landscape itself. The entities that enforce them have become part of the Appalachian ecosystem, as natural and enduring as the ancient peaks that hide their secrets. Modern descendants of these cursed bloodlines continue to struggle with their inherited obligations, some seeking ways to break contracts they never agreed to, others embracing their supernatural gifts despite the terrible costs. But the mountains remember every bargain, every drop of blood spilled in desperate agreements, and every family that chose survival over freedom. The children of the eternal harvest may have vanished from their isolated mountain compounds, but their methods of supernatural manipulation never truly disappeared. They simply evolved, adapting to modern technology and infiltrating systems far beyond their original mountain territories. What began as crude blood rituals in underground chambers has transformed into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. By the 1990s, scattered survivors and descendants of the original cult had established what intelligence sources now refer to as the Digital Harvest Network. Using early internet communications, they discovered they could maintain their ancestral practices while expanding their reach beyond the physical limitations of Appalachian geography. The network operates through seemingly legitimate businesses, telecommunications companies, data processing centers, and software development firms, all strategically located in remote areas throughout Appalachia. These operations serve dual purposes. Publicly, they provide essential services to rural communities. Privately, they harvest something far more valuable than data. Employee testimonials from those who fled these companies describe mandatory participation in team-building exercises held in basement facilities that bear striking resemblances to the original harvest chambers. Sarah Mitchell worked as a data analyst for Mountain View Processing Solutions in eastern Kentucky from 2018 to 2020. Her confidential testimony, obtained through a whistleblower protection program, reveals the modern face of the harvest practices. Every month, all employees were required to attend what they called synchronization sessions. She reported, "We'd gather in this underground conference room where the walls were covered with symbols I'd never seen before." The sessions involved employees placing their hands on specially designed computer interfaces while strange audio frequencies played through the sound system. People would go into these trance-like states, Mitchell continued. Afterward, their work performance would improve dramatically, but they'd become different, distant. More disturbing were the physical changes Mitchell observed. Long-term employees developed this pallor and their eyes would reflect computer screens in ways that didn't look natural. They'd work 18-hour days without fatigue, but they'd age rapidly. Most concerning were the monthly disappearances. Every few weeks, someone would simply stop showing up to work. The Digital Harvest Network's true innovation lies in its ability to conduct remote rituals through technology. Leaked internal documents describe something called distributed ceremonies, where participants in different locations can simultaneously engage in coordinated supernatural practices through specialized software. These programs, disguised as productivity tools or meditation apps, contain hidden functions that activate during specific astronomical events. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former computer scientist who worked on early versions of this software before discovering its true purpose, explained the technical mechanisms. The applications monitor biometric data through device sensors while displaying specific visual and audio patterns. The most chilling aspect of the digital harvest is its recruitment strategy. The software is distributed through free wellness apps, productivity tools, and that even children's educational games. Users unknowingly participate in preliminary rituals while believing they're simply using helpful applications. The software builds profiles of users' psychological vulnerabilities, Vasquez revealed. These modern recruitment methods have allowed the network to expand far beyond its Appalachian origins. Investigation records show active cells operating in major cities across the eastern United States, all coordinated through encrypted communications and synchronized ritual practices. Unlike their ancestors, who required physical presence in mountain compounds, contemporary practitioners can participate in harvest ceremonies from anywhere with internet access. The psychological manipulation has also evolved. Traditional cult isolation techniques have been replaced by digital dependency. Members become addicted to the applications, experiencing withdrawal symptoms when disconnected. They create artificial communities where members feel they belong, explained cult deprogramming specialist Dr. James Thornton. But the community only exists within their controlled digital environment. Law enforcement faces unprecedented challenges investigating these operations. The network's activities cross multiple jurisdictions, blend legitimate business with illegal practices, and utilize encryption technologies that make surveillance extremely difficult. Agent Rebecca Torres, who leads a federal task force investigating technologically enhanced cult activities, described the complexity. They're using the same privacy protections designed to safeguard legitimate users to hide criminal activities. The physical consequences of digital harvest participation mirror those reported from historical Appalachian cults, but manifest in new ways. They exhibit compulsive behaviors around electronic devices, claim to receive communications through digital static, and demonstrate knowledge of events occurring in distant locations. Medical examinations reveal unusual brain activity patterns and electromagnetic field disruptions around their bodies. Perhaps most disturbing are reports of hybrid ceremonies, where traditional Appalachian cult practices are combined with modern technology. Investigators have discovered facilities where participants engage in blood rituals while connected to sophisticated computer networks. These events allegedly allow the network to amplify their supernatural influence through digital infrastructure, potentially affecting internet users who have no knowledge of the cult's existence. Internal documents describe this as a coordinated global event where all network participants would simultaneously engage in their most powerful ritual, using internet infrastructure to extend their influence worldwide. Former members describe this as an attempt to recreate the original eternal harvest on a planetary scale. The children and grandchildren of the original Appalachian cult members have proven remarkably adaptable, maintaining their ancestral practices while embracing technologies their forebears could never have imagined. They've transformed from isolated mountain dwellers into a distributed network of technologically sophisticated practitioners who blend ancient supernatural beliefs with cutting-edge digital tools. What makes the Digital Harvest Network particularly dangerous is its invisibility. Unlike traditional cults that require physical compounds and obvious behavioral changes, this network operates through the very technologies most people use daily. Members maintain apparently normal lives while participating in supernatural practices through their smartphones, computers, and other connected devices. The network's influence extends into legitimate institutions through members who've infiltrated technology companies, government agencies, and educational systems. These individuals use their positions to embed cult-related elements into mainstream software and systems, potentially exposing millions of users to their influence without their knowledge or consent. As our world becomes increasingly connected through digital technology, the descendants of the Appalachian cults have found the perfect medium for expanding their ancient practices beyond any limitations their ancestors faced. They've proven that the hunger dwelling in those mountain hollows doesn't require physical proximity to spread its influence. In an age where everyone carries devices capable of connecting to global networks, the old ways have found new expressions that reach far beyond the misty peaks where they originated. These stories reveal a disturbing pattern that runs deeper than simple criminal activity or religious extremism. When desperation meets ancient mountains that seem to have their own consciousness, the resulting bargains create legacies that span generations. Whether these accounts represent historical fact or the collective nightmares of isolated communities may be less important than what they tell us about the human capacity for both survival and corruption. The Appalachian wilderness continues to guard its secrets, and perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain buried in the mist-shrouded hollows where they were born.